At my grandson's baby shower, my daughter-in-law picked up the quilt I'd spent 5 months sewing out of her father-in-law's flannel shirts, held it away from her body the way you'd hold something you found stuck to the bottom of a boot, and dropped it into the bin beside the gift table. "We're keeping the nursery neutral," she said, smiling for the phone her friend was holding up. "No offense, Grandma, but this really isn't our aesthetic." The room did that nervous little laugh, the one people do when they're not sure yet whose side is the safe one. I didn't say a word. I walked over, lifted my quilt out of the bin, folded it against my chest, and drove myself home before the cake was even cut. That night my son phoned me, and he was crying so hard he could barely get the words out. "Mom," he said. "Mom, please, what did you sew into Dad's shirts?" I sat down at my kitchen table with the quilt across my knees and Walt's whole heart still tucked safe inside the lining, and I said, as gently as I could, "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" Welcome back to Bold Mom Stories, where the gift somebody calls cheap is usually the only thing in the room money was never going to buy. Stay with me right to the end of this one, because the part that matters most doesn't happen at the shower. It happens 3 weeks later at my own kitchen table. Leave me a comment when you get there, and if stories like mine are the kind you keep coming back for, you know what to do. My name is Nora, and I'm 67 years old. For 31 years, I ran a little sewing and alteration shop 2 doors down from the credit union on the main street of a town small enough that the snowplow driver knows your name and your dog's name and roughly what time you take your coffee. I took in wedding dresses and let out funeral suits. I patched snowsuits in October and hemmed graduation gowns in June. I taught half the women in that town to thread a machine, and a few of the men too. I know fabric the way some people know weather coming off the lake. I can run my thumb along a seam and tell you whether it was made to last a season or a lifetime, and I learned a long time ago that those two things, what something costs and what something's worth, have almost nothing to do with each other. My hands aren't what they were. The arthritis settled into the knuckles about 6 winters back, the way it does up here, slow at first, and then, all of a sudden, you're soaking your fingers in a bowl of warm water every morning just to make them close around a needle. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand what 5 months of stitching cost me, and why I did it anyway, knuckles aching, working an hour at a time by the woodstove, because that was as long as my hands would give me before they quit. People look at a woman like me, and they see a harmless old lady with a pincushion. Sweet, a little behind the times. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that, and I let her, because being underestimated has its own quiet usefulness when you've lived long enough to know it. But I spent 31 years watching folks come into my shop in $300 coats with the buttons sewn on by a machine that didn't care, and walk back out happier in a 40-year-old Mackinac I'd mended for them by hand. I know what holds together. I know what comes apart at the first hard pull. And I knew, the night my son called me with his voice in pieces, that my daughter-in-law had just learned the difference in the cruelest way there is. Let me back up, because to understand the shirts you have to understand the man who wore them. My husband Walt passed 13 months before that shower. 44 years married, and then a bad cough that turned out to be something worse, and then a long November in the regional hospital an hour down the highway, and then a house that got so quiet, I started leaving the radio on just to have another voice in it. Walt worked 38 years at the mill outside of town. He was not what you'd call a flashy man. He drove the same half-ton until the floor pans rusted clean through. He wore the same plaid shirts so long the elbows went soft as tissue, and when I'd offer to buy him new ones, he'd say, "What's wrong with the ones I've got? They know me now." He was the kind of man who'd notice the new kid at the gas bar looked tired and leave a few extra dollars in the cup and never mention it again. But Walt was a saver, not a man who hoarded money, a man who planted it and let time do the work. He used to say the only thing that pays interest on patience is patience. While other men at the mill bought sleds and second trucks, Walt put a little away through the payroll plan every single year. Canada Savings Bonds bought right off his check a small amount each time automatically, so he never even felt it leave. He did it for 30 years. What I didn't fully understand until the very end was who he'd been saving for. Walt wanted to be a grandfather more than he'd ever wanted anything in his life. We'd waited a long, long time for it. Our son married late, and the baby was even slower to come, and Walt used to sit out on the porch in the summer dusk, swatting black flies, and telling me all the things he was going to teach that child. How to back a boat trailer down the launch, how to tell a lake trout from a splake, the terrible jokes he was going to inflict at every family supper for the next 20 years. He didn't make it. The baby was still just a due date on the calendar, a grainy ultrasound on the fridge, when Walt set his tools down for good. But here's the thing about a man who thinks in decades. He'd been getting ready to be a grandfather for nearly 30 years before there was a grandchild to get ready for. And he'd hidden the proof of it the whole time. Somewhere he knew I'd find it when it counted. About a week before he died, when we'd both stopped pretending, he asked me to bring him the old tin from the top shelf of the hall closet. The one with the faded picture of a lighthouse on the lid that I'd dusted around for 3 decades and never once opened because I figured it was old paperwork or his father's war medals or the kind of nothing a man keeps, because throwing it out feels like throwing out a piece of himself. It was full of bonds, stacks of them, held with elastic bands gone brittle and yellow, sorted by year, going back to before our son was even out of grade school. Bought a little at a time, every year, off every check. On a folded sheet of paper on top, in Walt's blocky carpenter's pencil, it said, "For the first grandbaby." Started the year our boy turned 8. Figured there'd be a little one someday, Walt told me, his voice down to almost nothing but his eyes still clear. Wanted to hand them a head start nobody could ever take off them. He pressed my hand. They've all come due now, Nor. 30 years of them. It adds up to real money. I asked him how much. He told me, "I'll save you the weight the family had to suffer through." It was just under $46,000. Every dollar of it, bought small and kept long by a man who never once carried a credit card balance in his life. Then he told me the part that mattered more than the money, the part I think about every single day since. "Don't just hand them a check," he said. "Money in an envelope, they'll spend it on a stroller with a French name and never once think of where it came from." He gave me that crooked smile of his. "Put it inside something you made, with your own 2 hands. Make them go looking for it. Make it last longer than I will." He squeezed once more. "You'll know what?" That was nearly the last clear instruction my husband ever gave me. And I meant to honor it exactly. So after the funeral, when the casseroles stopped coming and the house got loud with quiet, I went into the closet and I took out all his shirts. The green and black buffalo plaid he wore deer hunting. The soft gray flannel he wore to church when I made him. The red one, faded nearly pink at the shoulders, that he'd had so long it was practically family. And I started to cut. I made a quilt. 12 blocks across and 14 down, each square a piece of a shirt he'd lived his life in. I worked an hour a day, sometimes less, hands aching, picking the seams out so slow you'd have thought I was diffusing something. And I'll tell you, it was the hardest and the best thing I ever sewed, because every square smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and the cedar of the closet and the particular soap he used. And stitching it was like holding his hand a little longer than I was supposed to get to. Then I did the real work. Along the bottom edge, hidden inside the lining, where the binding folds over, I built a flat pocket. The kind I used to sew into the linings of travelers' coats, back in the shop, for the folks who didn't trust their money to a suitcase. Into a slim acid-free sleeve, the sort the archive lady at the library told me to use, I slid Walt's bonds, all 30 years of them, and one more thing. A letter. Walt had dictated it to me in the hospital, a few halting lines at a time, making me read it back twice to be sure I had it the way he wanted. A letter to the grandchild he'd never meet about who he was and where they came from and what he hoped for them. Sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened on your 18th birthday. Love, Grandpa Walt." I want to be clear about something, because a comment last time told me I left this part fuzzy. That pocket was made to be opened, not washed. The plan was simple. I'd hand over the quilt, let them turn it over, and find the unfamiliar weight along the bottom hem, and then I'd say, gentle as anything. "There's something tucked in there, dear. Feel along the binding." They'd take it out before the quilt ever saw a washing machine. The valuables would come out and live somewhere safe, and the quilt, the actual quilt, the one I'd bled into, would go on the baby's crib where it belonged. That was the whole of it. Now, let me tell you about my daughter-in-law, because I don't want her to come off as some cartoon villain, the way these stories sometimes go, and the way a few of you accused me of last time. She is more than that, and the more is the sad part. She grew up the only child of a woman who measures the entire world by what's printed on the tag. I met her mother exactly 3 times before the wedding, and all 3 times she found a way to mention what something cost. Her handbag, her car, the renovation, the cottage, that was really a second house. My daughter-in-law was raised to believe that the worth of a thing, a coat or a kitchen or a person, is the number on the price sticker, and that the very worst fate that can befall a woman is to be caught looking common. So she curates. Her home looks like the inside of a magazine you'd feel underdressed to read. Her clothes are deliberate. And once the pregnancy started, the baby became the centerpiece of the whole production. A designer nursery in 3 shades of grage, a registry full of brands I couldn't have pronounced if you'd paid me. A whole performance of the perfect little life, filmed and posted and admired by strangers. I tried to like her. I did try. She wasn't cruel to me, not at first. She just looked at me the way she looked at a thrift shop, a polite, faint wariness, like she might catch something. And I came to believe over time that underneath every last label, my daughter-in-law is frightened. Frightened exactly the way her own mother taught her to be. Frightened that if the wrong person ever looks too closely, they'll see something cheap. And the cruel joke of people raised that way is that they can't recognize the genuinely precious when it's sitting right in their lap, because the precious thing didn't arrive with a logo on it. She was about to prove that in front of 40 people with a camera running, and she had no earthly idea what she was holding when she did. And I have to tell you about my son, because the part of this that still aches at 3 in the morning isn't her. It's him. My boy is a good man who has spent his entire life ducking conflict the way some people duck under low branches, automatically, without even thinking. He's gentle and he's funny, and he loved his father like the ground his father walked on. And somewhere in the years of loving his wife and keeping her mother happy, he went quiet. He agreed. He smoothed things over. He kept the peace because peace was easier, and my son has always chosen easier. After Walt died, my boy fell apart the way quiet men do, privately, where it wouldn't trouble anybody. He'd call me late some nights just to talk about his dad. He kept Walt's old fishing cap on a hook by his back door. He, of anyone alive, knew exactly who his father was, which is why, when the truth finally came out, it didn't crack his wife at all. She deflected. It broke my son clean in half, because my son was sitting right there at that shower. My son watched his wife call his dead father's life's work not our aesthetic and drop it in the bin, and my son, keeping the peace, choosing easier, said nothing. Laughed along, even. A small, nervous laugh. He didn't know what was inside. I want to be fair to him about that. He didn't know. But he knew that quilt was made of his father's shirts. He knew his grieving mother had sewn it with her ruined hands, and he let it go into the garbage to avoid a scene. That's the thing he's going to carry to his own grave, not her cruelty, his own silence. Hold on to that, because the voice breaking on my phone that night belonged to a man who'd just figured out what his quiet had cost. The invitation came on thick cream cardstock with a little gold deckled edge. There was a dress code. For a baby shower. I didn't mind. I was, God help me, looking forward to it. I had the single most important gift in the world folded on my dresser, and I'd run the whole moment in my head a dozen times. They'd open the box, find the quilt, I'd point them to the binding, and the entire room would understand that a man who couldn't be there had been quietly loving this baby for 30 years before it drew a breath. Make them go looking for it, Walt had said. I was going to make sure they found it. I bought a new blouse for the occasion. Navy with a bit of lace at the collar. I wrapped the box in plain brown paper because I have always thought a beautiful thing doesn't need a gold bow to announce itself, and I tied it with a strip of the same blue ribbon I'd used along the quilt's border. I set it on the passenger seat of my car, where Walt used to ride, and I talked to him a little on the drive over the way I still do. "Big day, Walt," I said. "We're giving them your bonds today. Can you believe it? We made it to grandparents after all." I had no idea I was about to watch a stranger drop my husband into a garbage can. Her mother's house was done up like the lobby of a boutique hotel. White peonies in February, which up here means flown in from the other side of the planet. A balloon arch in 3 careful shades of beige. A long table of tiny catered things. Macarons. Little squares of something. Nothing you could actually call food. There was a backdrop with the baby's name spelled out in gold script, a name they'd chosen. My daughter-in-law told everyone, because it tested well. I brought butter tarts, homemade. I set them on the end of the table and watched them sit there, untouched, all afternoon beside the macarons, and I thought, well, there it is. There's the whole thing in a nutshell. Everyone there was younger and glossier than me, dressed in clothes that knew they were being photographed. I felt like a chickadee that had got in through an open door and couldn't find its way back out. I took a chair near the edge, where the old aunts are meant to sit, and I held my plain brown box on my lap. And every time some young woman glanced at it with that little flicker of pity, I just thought about the pockets sewn along the bottom hem, and I smiled to myself. Secrets keep you warm. I want you to understand that, because it's the part I grieve the most now. I walked in happy. I walked in carrying my dead husband's whole heart, ready to give it away with both hands, and glad to do it. I had no armor on. Why would I? You don't wear armor to a baby shower. You bring a gift and a full heart, and you assume the people there will at least be kind. Walt's sister was there. My sister-in-law, 63, sharp as a tack, and the only other person in that room who'd actually loved my husband. She squeezed in beside me and nodded at the catering table. "In my day," she muttered, "we put out a relish tray and a coffee urn, and the species carried on just fine." I laughed. She patted my box. "Is that the famous quilt? Walt told me what you were tucking into it, the old softy. That baby is one lucky little fish." She had no idea, neither of us did, that her assuming everyone knew was about to become the fuse on the whole thing. The gift opening was run like a product launch. My daughter-in-law sat in a tall white chair under the balloon arch. Her friend filmed. Her mother narrated each gift to the room. "Oh, that's the Italian one. Isn't it just gorgeous?" And my daughter-in-law held every present up to the camera, named the brand, and thanked the giver by tagging them in the air, like the whole point of the thing was the label it came with. A cashmere sleeper. A diaper bag that cost what I used to clear in a good month at the shop. A stroller with a name like a sports car. Each one held up, admired, photographed, set on a growing little mountain beside her chair. I watched my son across the room. He stood near the wall, with a drink he wasn't drinking, wearing the face of a man who'd rather be ice fishing in a blizzard. He caught my eye once and gave me a small, helpless shrug, like a boy apologizing for the weather. I should have read that shrug for what it was. It was the shrug of a man who already knew his wife was about to do something unkind and had already quietly decided not to stand in her way. And then there were only 2 gifts left. A card in an envelope and my plain brown box with its blue ribbon. Her mother picked up my box, read the little tag, and announced, "From Grandma," in the gentle sing-song voice you'd use for a child's macaroni art. A couple of people went, "Ow!" A phone came up. My daughter-in-law took the box, gave the brown paper a quick once-over, and the corner of her mouth did something I didn't care for. "Let's see what Grandma made," she said, and she pulled the paper away. For one moment, one single moment, I let myself hope. The paper fell, and there it was. 5 months of my hands, the soft plaids, the faded reds, Walt's whole working life laid out in squares, his initials hidden in the corner block like a held breath. In that bright, glossy room full of things assembled in factories by people who'd never know who got them, my quilt looked, to my eye, like the only honest thing in the building. She held it up by 2 corners, the way you'd hold something to check it for a stain. I watched it register on her face that it was handmade. The slight unevenness that means a living person sat and made this, the very thing the magazines now charge a fortune for. I watched her decide what it meant to her. Her nose wrinkled, just a little. "Oh," she said, "is this made out of old shirts?" "Your father-in-law's shirts, dear," I said, and my voice was warm, and I started to lean forward to tell her about the binding, about the pocket, about Walt. "There's something special sewn into it if you," but she was already talking over me, to the room, to the camera. "That's so sweet," she said, in the voice you use to end a conversation. "It's very vintage." And her mother gave that little, tinkling laugh and said, "Bless her heart, she tried." I felt the room tilt the way it does. That old, familiar feeling of being made small, but I still didn't understand what was coming. I thought the worst of it was going to be the word vintage and the bless her heart. I figured I'd smile through it, point her to the binding in private, and let the bonds redeem the whole sorry afternoon. I was wrong about how far she'd take it. What happened next happened fast, and I've run it in slow motion 10,000 times since. She folded the quilt back over her arm with a kind of finality. She looked around at her beige party and her registry mountain, and her watching friends, and the phone pointed at her, and I watched her do the arithmetic. The social math of a woman who lives for an audience. A quilt made out of a dead man's flannel shirts didn't fit the picture. It clashed with the brand. And somewhere in that label-measured heart of hers, she decided the funny, on-brand, content-worthy thing to do was to make a little bit of a joke out of it. There was a tall stainless bin at the end of the gift table, lined with a crisp white bag for the wrapping paper. She stood up, the quilt over her arm, and crossed to it. "Okay, so," she said, laughing, playing it up for the camera. "I love Grandma, but we've got a whole neutral thing going for the nursery." She held the quilt out over the open bin like a magician about to drop a scarf. "And honestly, it smells a little like an old man's closet," and she let go. "My quilt, Walt's shirts, Walt's initials, Walt's $46,000. Walt's last letter to the grandson he'd never hold, dropped into the garbage on top of the torn wrapping paper, and the room laughed. Not all of it, but enough. That nervous, follow-the-leader laugh of people who've decided the powerful one in the room is the one being funny. Her friend's phone caught every second of it. Her mother clapped, delighted, and my son, my boy, went gray against the wall, opened his mouth, and closed it again. He said nothing. That was the worst second of the whole day. Not the quilt in the bin. My son's clumps. "It smells a little like an old man's closet." I've heard a lot of unkind things in 67 years. I've been called old-fashioned, behind the times, a sweet little nobody with a pincushion. None of it ever landed the way those words did, in that bright beige room, with my husband's heart sitting in a garbage can. Now here is the hinge of the whole thing. So listen close. I had a choice in that moment. I'll have it. I could have said, "You foolish, frightened girl. Do you have the first idea what you just threw out? There is $46,000 in that quilt. There is the last letter your child's grandfather will ever write." I could have made a scene they'd still be talking about at the rink in 10 years' time. And part of me, the widow, the mother bear, the woman whose ruined fingers had bled into those rows, wanted to, badly. But I didn't, because in that exact second, 3 things were true all at once. 1. The bonds in the letter were safe, sealed shut along the binding, and she hadn't found them and wasn't going to. 2. A camera was running, and the cruelty was being filmed by the cruel one's own friend, which meant the truth would keep just fine without my help. And 3. This is the one that decided it. I looked at that performing, frightened young woman, and I understood that the worst thing I could possibly do to her was not make a scene. It was to let her find out later, when she could no longer pretend she didn't know. So I did the one thing in that room with any dignity left in it. I stood up quietly, walked over to the bin, and reached in to take back what was mine. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and watched something you made with love get treated like garbage, your time, your hands, your heart, tossed aside because it didn't come with the right name on it, then you know the particular silence that follows. The silence of deciding how much of yourself you're willing to defend in front of people who've already decided you're not worth defending. If that silence is familiar to you, stay with me, because this is where it turns. I lifted the quilt out of the bin. A scrap of tissue paper clung to it, and I brushed it off the way you'd brush crumbs off a child's sweater. I folded it neatly, the way 31 years behind a counter teaches your hands to fold without your mind having to be there at all, and I tucked it under my arm. The room had gone quiet now. The laugh had curdled. Even she seemed to sense she'd misjudged the wind, and she covered it the only way she knew how. "Oh, did you want it back?" "That's fine, take it. Sorry, It's all right, dear," I said, and my voice was perfectly steady. "It isn't really your kind of thing. I'll hang on to it." And I could see that steadiness bother her more than any amount of yelling would have. She'd braced for tears or a tantrum, the two reactions her world had ever prepared her for. A calm old woman folding a quilt and saying, "I'll hang on to it," did not compute. "I think I'll head home," I said to the room, gently. "Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the baby." I found my sister-in-law's eyes, gave her the smallest nod, picked up my bag with Walt inside it, and walked out of that boutique hotel house with my back straight. I didn't cry until I was in the car with the door shut. Then I let myself fall apart for exactly as long as it took to feel it. I held the quilt against my chest, and it still smelled faintly of the bin. And that, somehow, was the thing that undid me. That Walt's last gift, his 30 patient years, had spent 2 minutes smelling like a garbage bag because a young woman thought it would play well on her page. "I'm sorry, Walt," I whispered into the plaid. "I should have just told them. I should have guarded it better. But here's the strange thing about grief and clarity. They'll ride in the same car." By the time my tears stopped, something underneath them had gone very calm and very certain. The way that, say, the surface of the lake goes glass still on a cold morning and you can suddenly see clear to the bottom. I was not going to hand those bonds over. Not like this. Not into hands that would call them tacky if they showed up without a brand on them. Walt had said, "Make it last, make them go looking, make it mean something." You cannot hand a legacy to someone who throws legacies in the trash for content. It would be like pouring good water into a cracked cup. But the baby, little Owen, who hadn't done one single thing wrong, who was innocent of all of it, the baby still deserved his grandfather's gift. That part was never in question. Walt had saved it for the child, not the child's mother. So somewhere on the dark drive home, with the snow coming sideways through the headlights, I stopped thinking like a heartbroken widow and started thinking like a woman who'd run a business for 31 years. How to make this last exactly the way Walt asked, in a way that nobody could ever throw out. The phone was already ringing when I got in the door, and it wasn't my son. Not yet. It was my sister-in-law, and her voice was tight. "I'm so ashamed," she said. "I should have stood up. I should have said something." "You and my boy both," I said, not unkindly. "It's all right. I've got it. It's safe." She never found the pocket. There was a pause, and then she said the thing that lit the fuse, though neither of us knew it yet. "Honey," she said, "I have to tell you. After you left, I was so rattled I said something to your son. I told him his father would be heartbroken, all those bonds finally going to the baby in that quilt just the way Walt wanted." Her voice caught. "Nora." The look on his face. I don't think he knew. I think I just told my nephew what he watched his wife put in the garbage. I closed my eyes. "It's all right," I said again, though my heart had started to ache in a brand new direction now, toward my son. "He went white as the snow," she said. "He left right after. Didn't say a word to her. Just got in his truck and went." I thanked her, and I hung up, and I stood there in my kitchen with the quilt in my arms, understanding that somewhere across town, my boy was driving home with a piece of information, going off like a flare inside his chest. That he now knew the quilt in the bin had held his father's 30-year gift and his last written words, that he'd watched it happen and laughed his little nervous laugh and said nothing. I put the kettle on because I knew the way mothers know that my son was going to call. 3 minutes later, he did. I'll tell you what I'd done in those 3 minutes of waiting, because it matters. I'd carried the quilt to the table and, with the same little seam ripper I'd used 10,000 times in the shop, I'd carefully opened the hidden pocket, not to take anything out, but to be sure it was all still there and undamaged. To touch it, the bonds were exactly as I'd folded them, 30 years of my husband's patience in a neat stack. And the letter in its sealed envelope. To be opened on your 18th birthday. Love, Grandpa Walt. I held that envelope and thought about the hospital room where he'd dictated it, stopping for breath between sentences, making me read it back. He'd wanted that letter to outlive him by decades. He'd wanted a teenager someday, long after Walt was just a photograph and a name on a stone, to open an envelope and meet his grandfather for the very first time. And a young woman in a party dress had nearly thrown that meeting in the garbage for a laugh. I left the pocket open. I had a feeling I'd be opening it properly very soon, for the right people. Then the phone rang, and it was my son, and his voice was already broken before he got a single word out. "Mom," he said, and it cracked clean in half on that one syllable. "Mom, please tell me you took it home. Please tell me you have it." "I have it, sweetheart," I said. "It's right here on my kitchen table. It's safe." I heard him exhale like a man coming up from deep water, a long, shaking breath that turned, halfway through, into something that wasn't quite a sob. "Oh, thank God," he said. "Oh, thank God." And then, in a whisper, "Mom, what did you sew into Dad's shirts?" And there it was. The question the whole terrible day had been driving toward. My son, alone in his truck in his own driveway, asking what his wife had thrown away. I could have softened it. I could have spared him. But my boy is 35 years old and a father now, and there are some things a man needs to hear in full, because the full weight of them is the whole point. "Your father's bonds, sweetheart," I said. "All of them. The ones he bought off every paycheck for almost 30 years, starting the year you turned 8. They've come due. They're worth just under $46,000. I let that sit a moment. "And his letter." "The last one. The one he dictated to me in the hospital for the baby to open at 18, so a boy who'll never get to meet his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway." I kept my voice steady, for his sake. "That's what was inside, sweetheart. That's what your father sewed his whole heart into. That's what you watched go into the bin." The line went very, very quiet, and then my son, my gentle, peacekeeping, conflict-ducking son, made a sound I hadn't heard out of him since he was a small boy with a skinned knee. A raw, helpless, breaking sound. "It wasn't the money, Mom," he got out, and that was the thing I'd been praying I'd hear, and the thing those of you in the comments last time were right to want. "I don't even care about the money. You made that. You made it out of his shirts, with your hands that hardly work anymore, and I stood there. I was right there, and I let her, and I laughed." He was crying so hard now the words came out in pieces. "I let her throw away the thing you made. I let her say it smelled like him, like that was something to be ashamed of. That was Dad. Those were his shirts, and I just stood against the wall. I let him cry." Sometimes that's the whole job of being a mother. You let them cry and you don't rush it, and you don't fix it too fast. "How are you so calm?" he asked me finally. "How are you not screaming at me? I'd understand if you never spoke to either of us again." "Because I have it, my love," I said. "Because your father's gift is safe on my table, and that baby is going to get every last cent of it and every word of that letter. Nothing precious was actually lost today. Only some illusions, and those needed losing anyway." I paused. And because being calm is the only thing I've ever found that the people who threw it away can't argue with, he was quiet a long moment. Then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years, steady, with something hard underneath it that had been missing his whole adult life, "Tell me what you want to do, whatever it is. For once I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one." And there it was, the first real backbone I'd heard in my son in a decade. It had cost him this much to find it. Maybe it always does. "I want one thing," I told him. "I want the whole family in one room, at my house, where the kitchen smells like something good. Your wife and her mother if she'll come, and your aunt. And I want to give Owen his grandfather's gift properly, out loud, where everyone can see exactly what it is and exactly what nearly happened to it." I let that land. "Your father said make them go looking for it. So we're going to find it together. Just a few weeks later than I'd planned." It took some weeks to arrange, partly because the baby came right in the middle of it. Owen arrived on a Thursday in a March storm, 7 pounds and furious about the whole arrangement, with his grandfather's exact deep frown stamped on his little face. The first time they set him in my arms, that cross little brow working itself up to a holler, I had to sit down. I saw Walt so clearly. "There you are," I whispered to him. "We've been saving up for you a long time, little man." For a few days, I let myself hope the baby might melt the whole business, that the gathering wouldn't even be needed. My daughter-in-law was softer that first week, exhausted and human the way new mothers are, the labels temporarily forgotten under spit-up and no sleep. And then I saw her first posted photo of Owen, styled, filtered, in a $400 outfit, captioned with brand names. And I understood that the softness was a phase and the values were the foundation. That baby was already being measured for the same little price tags his mother had been raised inside, which meant Walt's gift and Walt's letter mattered now more than ever. Somewhere in that boy's life, he was going to need the opposite lesson, the one sewn by hand and paid for in patience and waiting in an envelope marked 18. So I sent the invitations. Sunday supper, my house, everyone. And I got out the quilt. They came on a gray Sunday evening into a house that smelled of roast and gravy, because there are kindnesses you can do with an oven that you can't do any other way. My son, drawn and quiet, carrying the baby. My daughter-in-law, polished again, wary. Her mother, who came because missing it would have looked worse than showing up. And my sister-in-law, who arrived early to peel potatoes and to stand at my shoulder like the family Walt would have wanted there. I'd set the table nice. And in the center, where the flowers would go, I'd laid the quilt, washed now. The bin smell long gone, the plaids bright, Walt's initials in the corner block, folded with the hidden pocket facing up. My daughter-in-law's eyes went to it the second she walked in, and her face did something complicated. She'd hoped, I think, that it had quietly disappeared, the way uncomfortable things tend to disappear for people who are used to having discomfort handled for them. "We ate first," I insisted. "You don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach," and I wanted everyone fed and settled and unable to claim afterward they'd been ambushed. We talked about the baby. It was almost pleasant. My daughter-in-law even thanked me for the roast and seemed surprised to find she meant it. Then I cleared the plates, and I sat back down, and I laid my hand flat on the quilt. "I'd like to give Owen his gift from his grandfather now," I said. "Properly, this time. The way Walt asked me to before he passed." The table went still. My son's jaw tightened, her mother set down her wine. My daughter-in-law went carefully, deliberately blank. "You held this quilt a few weeks ago," I said to her, and my voice was warm and steady, and not one bit unkind, which I think made it land all the harder. "And you decided what it was worth, and you put it in the garbage. I'd like to show you, and everyone here, what you were actually holding." And I picked up the seam ripper. I opened that pocket in front of all of them, slow and deliberate, the little blade sliding through the stitches I'd sewn so carefully, and I drew the contents out and laid them on the clean tablecloth. One at a time, the way a teller counts out money, which is more or less what I was doing. "These," I said, setting down the thick stack, "are Canada savings bonds. Your father bought them, son. A few dollars off every check every year through the payroll plan at the mill, starting the year you turned 8. The note in his tin said, "For the first grandbaby." I smoothed the stack with 2 fingers. "They've all come due. They're worth just under $46,000. The number went round the table like a draft off the lake. Her mother's mouth opened. My daughter-in-law had gone very pale. "And this," I said, setting down the envelope as gently as you'd set down a sleeping child, "is the last letter your husband ever wrote, son. He dictated it to me in the hospital. It's for Owen to open on his 18th birthday. So that a boy who'll never meet his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway." I rested my hand on it. Walt's words to me were, "Make them go looking, make it last." "This is what you were holding at the shower," I said, and I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, and I kept my voice as soft as I have ever kept it. $46,000 and a dying man's last words. This is what you called vintage. This is what you said smelled like an old man's closet. This is what you dropped in the bin, on camera, in front of 40 people, because it didn't suit your color scheme. Nobody breathed. That video of hers was still out there somewhere, and everyone at the table knew it. She did what she does. She reached straight for the version where she was the one wronged. "You can't put this on me," she said, her voice climbing. How was I supposed to know? Who sews $46,000 into a blanket and doesn't tell anybody? That's basically a trap. You set me up. I didn't let you do anything, dear, I said, still calm. Your husband's father asked, with nearly his last breath, that the gift be hidden inside something handmade, so it would be treasured instead of spent and forgotten. I honored him. I made one foolish assumption, that nobody would ever throw a quilt made out of a dead man's shirts into the garbage. That assumption was my only mistake. The throwing was entirely yours. It was a joke, she said. It was for the camera, I finished gently. I know, that's rather the whole problem, isn't it? I folded my hands. You said you only use designer things. So when the one truly priceless thing in that room came into your hands, you put it in the bin because it didn't have a brand on it, and because your friend was filming, and because you've been taught your whole life that worth is a number somebody else printed on a tag. I let it sit. There's no tag stitched into 30 years of a man saving for a child he knew he might not live to meet. You couldn't see it because nobody ever taught you how to look, and it nearly cost your son his inheritance and his grandfather's last words. Her mother started in, "Now, that's hardly fair." I turned my eyes to her just once. "You taught her how to look," I said. "I'd sit this one out," and she sat it out. Then I told them what I'd decided, because mercy and consequence can sit at the same table when you set it right. "Here's what happens now," I said. "Owen gets every cent. Walt saved it for the baby, and the baby will have it." I laid my hand on the bonds, but not the way it was meant to be handed over. I can't put an open account into a household that throws legacies in the trash for a video. So I've already been down to the credit union and seen the advisor. This is going into a registered education plan and an in-trust account for Owen and Owen alone, for his schooling, his start in life. I'm the one named on it. It can't be spent, or borrowed against, or touched by his parents. Not by you, dear. Not by you, son. Not even by me. Only Owen, when the time comes, and only for what Walt meant it for. My son nodded slowly, and I saw with a small ache that he understood the locking out included him, and that he didn't argue, because he knew he'd earned it standing against that wall. "And the quilt," I said, "comes home with me tonight. Owen can have it when I'm sure it'll be honored and not before. A precious thing isn't safe in a house that didn't know it was precious." My daughter-in-law opened her mouth to argue about the quilt, of all things, which tells you she still hadn't understood a single word. And my son, my quiet boy, finally spoke. He said her name, just her name, but in a voice I had never once heard him use with her in all the years they'd been married. "Don't," he said. "Not one more word. Not about the quilt. Not about whose fault. Not one more word." And for the first time since I'd known her, she closed her mouth and kept it closed. It had taken $46,000 and a dead man's letter to give my son a spine. But there it was. Better late than never. There was one thing left, the most important thing, the thing Walt actually wanted. "His letter to Owen waits, sealed, until the boy is 18, I said. But Walt wrote a few lines for the rest of us, too. For the day the family first found out about the gift. He made me promise I'd read it out loud when that day came." I took a second, smaller envelope from my cardigan pocket. He didn't know it would be a day like this one. But here we are. I opened it, and my hands shook, and not from the arthritis this time, and I read my husband's words to his family across my own kitchen table, with his grandson asleep in his son's arms. "If you're hearing this," I read, "then the little one's finally here, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there to be a nuisance about it. I started putting money away for this baby before there was a baby, because the best thing my own grandfather ever gave me wasn't money. It was knowing somebody had been thinking about me before I was even born. That's what's tucked in here, little one. Proof you were wanted, a long time before you arrived, by an old fellow who never got to meet you. Spend it on something that lasts. And whatever you do," my voice broke here, and I let it, "be the kind of family that can tell the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. Your grandmother can. Learn it off her. All my love, Grandpa Walt." The room was silent. My sister-in-law was weeping into her napkin. My son had his face pressed to the top of his sleeping boy's head, his shoulders going. And my daughter-in-law was looking at the quilt on the table, the the one she'd thrown away, and I do believe it was the first time she had ever actually seen it. It was far too late to be forgiveness. But it might, just possibly, have been the start of learning how to look. Here's how it shook out over the months after. Because I know you want the ledger, and not just the feeling. The fund is locked and quietly growing, doing for Owen exactly what Walt intended, waiting the same patient way Walt himself would have waited. The video, the one her friend posted before any of us knew what was inside, turned out to have been seen by more of the family than she realized. She took it down the day my son told her the truth. But the internet keeps what you feed it, and enough people had already seen it that she spent a long, quiet season being known, in her own circle, as the woman who put her child's inheritance out with the recycling for a laugh. I didn't do that to her. She filmed it herself. There's a lesson in that too about living your life for a lens. Her mother and I will never be close, but she has stopped saying, "Bless her heart" to me, which around here counts as a peace treaty. My daughter-in-law has never properly apologized. She isn't built for it. But a few weeks after that supper she asked me, in a very small voice, if I would teach her to sew. We've made one lopsided, ugly, wonderful little hat for Owen together. Her first handmade thing. She kept it. She didn't throw it out. It's a start. My son is the one who changed the most. Grief and shame did to him what 40 years of easy never could. They grew him a backbone. He came to me about a month after, alone, and sat at my table where the quilt had been, and said, "I've been replaying it, the shower, and I keep landing on the same thing." I didn't fail Dad when I let the quilt go in the bin. I failed him 100 times before that, every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. That one was just the time I couldn't unsee. "You knew that about me for years," I told him. "Why didn't you ever say?" "Because some things a person has to find for himself," I said. "I could have told you 1,000 times. It took a quilt in a garbage can to make you believe it." He keeps his father's fishing cap on the hook still, but now he's told that boy he'll teach him to back a trailer himself, the way Walt would have. He's still learning how not to choose easy, he told me. But he's choosing it on purpose now, when he does. That's new, and I'm proud of him. Better late. The quilt lives on Owen's crib these days. It took a few months, long enough for me to be sure the house it was going into had learned, even a little, what it was holding. When I finally carried it over, my daughter-in-law had cleared a place of honor for it and put away the designer throw that used to be there, and she didn't say a word, and neither did I. And that silence was a different kind than the one at the shower. That one I could live inside. So that's the whole of it. A young woman looked at 30 years of love and saw something that didn't match her wallpaper. And an old man who thought, in decades, made sure that the very thing she threw away was the one thing in that room she could never, ever buy back. Owen sleeps under his grandfather's shirts now. And someday, on a birthday a long way off, a young man is going to open an envelope and find out he was wanted before he ever drew a breath. By a grandfather he never met, and a grandmother who refused to be quiet about what love is worth, even when being quiet would have been so much easier.